Super Mario RPG released for the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo in 1996. Practically everything we're going to be talking about between the Super Famicom and the SNES version has to do with localization. Meanwhile, the remake was developed by Piazza in Unity, the localization was handled by Nintendo, and Yoko Shimomura returned to be in charge of the music, while both Square and Nintendo supervised various aspects. Now, as always, these videos are made possible by patrons, channel members, and by the documentation and research made available by the game's communities, so you can check these sources for more information on what's discussed. A lot of valuable information regarding the Japanese version's text and references comes from Clive Mandolin from Legends of Localization. Thank you to Pidge01 for providing feedback and additional info throughout this video. This website will show later from Kyrulius, Trogdor, and her shows you action command timings for both the original and the remake. She's also leading a project to preserve print media for Super Mario RPG over on GoFundMe if you're interested in preservation efforts. We'll start with Super Mario RPG for the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo. Many names of characters, locations, items, abilities, and equipment in various terminology were altered in accordance with the series conventions, space constraints, or, of course, things that wouldn't make sense to most people not born in Japan. You'll see what I mean. Similarly, the UI of the menu and save screen were altered to fit English text, and even the UI in battle was altered for the North America's different controller colors. The Japanese version had a cheat code Easter egg gag that doesn't do anything that was cut from the North America version. Some Japanese traits remained in the localization, such as Lucky 2's Japanese name represented on this bus. While some names were changed to their established localized names, some weren't. There's a half dozen enemies misnamed, such as Bloopers are Bloobers, Cheep Cheeps are Gobi, and some abilities were misnamed as well, like Fireball is Drain, and Exor's mouth is called Neosquid for some reason. Bowser's victory pose was altered overseas since the gesture is offensive in some places. The password on the sunken ship was changed from aquarium to pearls, though the answer's letter locations on the boxes are identical. The item, Peach's XXX, became Toadstool's triple question mark, and note that XXX doesn't have the same connotation as it does in English. So while English speakers got 90s pop culture references throughout the whole game, such as Bruce Lee, Madonna, Power Rangers or Super Sentai, or Tchaikovsky, Japan actually got some of those too, along with a lot of 90s Japanese pop culture references via Thought Peaks. There's a comedian with a Famicom game, Lupin III, quite a bit of Neon Genesis Evangelion, Sailor Moon, Fist of the North Star, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Virtua Fighter, Mobile Suit Gundam, this seafood restaurant commercial, and an innuendo. There's a lot more, so check out Legends of Localization's article on the Psychopath messages, or even their stream playthroughs of the game comparing the script as they go. While references are one thing, there are changes that are hit or miss, such as thought peaks or characterizations, like the Axum Rangers or the girl who pranks Mario into jumping, but in Japanese she's just a fangirl of jumping people. And a prime example is that Culex was more or less a Final Fantasy themed gag, wondering why everyone is 3D while he's 2D, but in English he's more omnipotent, which could have been done with consideration the Western target audience might not have been as familiar with Final Fantasy, since Final Fantasy VI, for example, wasn't considered a commercial success in the US. And outside of localization, the most we could possibly discuss with differences is a single bug where in the Japanese version, the lamp in the Marymore Hotel would flip overnight. The Virtual Console and subsequent re-releases made changes such as toning down effects like Static E and Flame Wall, and oddly, color palettes to Rocky Terrain were altered at Moleville, Booster's Pass, and Land's End. The Virtual Console was the first time Europe got Super Mario RPG, and because of that, Croco says pest instead of bugger. And while Europe had colored SNES controllers, the PAL version didn't use them. And now for Super Mario RPG for the Nintendo Switch. Many more languages are now localized, including French, German, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Chinese, and Korean. We have a lot to talk about outside of the script and localization, but we'll get it out of the way first. The English localization was selective with what was kept, keeping some of the more notable and charming changes, though in some cases they revised the script for one reason or another, including consistency with the series today, consistency with the Japanese version of the game, or more screen real estate for text that wasn't previously possible. All the enemy, item, and ability names we mentioned earlier were corrected, but Mario still wears shirts instead of overalls. There were a ton of name changes, so here are some examples. Yaridovich is now Speardovich, Mac is now Claymore Morton and the Shysters are now Shymores, Frogfucius is now Frogsage, Neosquid is now Mouth, Psychopath is now Thoughtpeak, Drain is now Hotshot since Fire Orb is now Fireball, Mega Drain is now Fire Saber, Keto Cola is now Coca-Cola, Elixir is Frogleg Cola, and my favorites, the Mimic Chests, are now named Please No, Huh, What, Oh, and Come On. Booster isn't described as having the face of a totem pole, Bowser calls the party nincompoops instead of cretins, and Croco still says pest. Many thought peaks are now closer to the Japanese dialogue, such as the Axum Rangers, Starcruster, Knife Guy, or when Mario is presented as an art piece. Some of the thought peaks with rhythm or wordplay were properly localized. Generally, the 90s Japanese references weren't localized, though I believe Krusty and Ninja are exceptions. Some pop culture references in English ended up being dropped, like Bruce Lee, James Bond, and famous explorers. In contrast, as far as I could tell, the Japanese thought peaks weren't touched, including the unused ones, outside of adding furigana to the kanji and the one that was an innuendo. Bowser's victory animation now has him performing a kabuki mie pose. Mario, Mallow, and Peach don't do the peace sign anymore either, as Miyamoto says the peace sign is considered too childish. Culex now addresses how he is a 2D character in a 3D world, but his more omnipotent nature in the original localization was mixed in a bit. The Japanese cheat code Easter egg was also retained in all regions. And outside of the localization, there is new dialogue, for example when going to Vista Hill with other characters. Geno Whirl can still crit and do 9,999 damage to Exor, though other useful bugs were not replicated. However, the Marrymore lamp does turn overnight like it did in the Super Famicom version. We've got both new mechanics and quality of life features. There's fast travel, autosaves running by default, picking up items in the field doesn't pause the game anymore. The 6-door trial in Bowser's Keep offers a give up option, letting you check all of the doors without them randomizing. The sunken ship puzzle also lets you give up and is zoomed in, so it's easier to tell your elevation. Pressing X brings up the consumable items and Y brings up usable magic for healing. You can reread tutorials at any point in battle or in the menu. The coin limit was raised from 999 to 9,999. Flower items as well as rare weapons items and accessories can't be sold anymore. More items are treated as key items. Hitting enemies with their weaknesses or resistances are now shown. You're told when the enemy is almost defeated, and many permanently missable items are no longer missable. Booster's charm from the curtain minigame is rewarded for his post-game fight. The feather accessory from Dodo can be obtained from the Toad in Moleville, and for both of those items that means you can get 2 of them, and you can use other Toads in the Mushroom Castle hallway to get the hidden treasure. There's also a bestiary accompanied by an NPC to buy entries for it that tracks animations, thought peaks, and even new commentary for every enemy. And there's also a new journal tracking your progression. Before, you had 29 item slots, and going over that meant throwing items away. Items will now stack, but to maintain balance, you can only hold a limited quantity of each item, and when you do go over, items are sent to a storage box in Mario's pad. For those inclined, the options menu gives you options for things like default movement speed, which buttons confirm in battle if you want the SNES controls, and skip targeting if there's only one target. There's also a new breezy mode difficulty you can enable anytime, where you hold up to 30 of any item, enemy stats are reduced by 10%, they give more XP, and it's easier to do action commands and to flee. The action gauge is a meter you build up that can be spent on triple moves when you get 3 characters. Every party combo has a different attack, all with pre-rendered cutscenes to them, and different attributes like single target or defense-based. The Bowyer fight is also reworked to be a tutorial for this at the end of it. You build up your action gauge via action commands, and executing many in a row is now kept track of via a chain. Certain increments in the chain grant buffs determined by who's in your party. Every 10 chains fills the action gauge a bit, and chains carry between battles. Special enemies are randomly encountered enemies with specifically an encounter rate of 20%, with tripled stats and immunity to crits, but they give you twice as many coins and XP plus a frog coin. There's also new post-game content. Beating the game unlocks the sound player, the play report, which are functionally achievements, and you can rematch 7 bosses who all have new challenging twists to their fight to satisfy your desire for more challenge by requiring strategies like min-maxing a stat or performing consecutive perfect blocks. The rewards include new equipment like stronger weapons and new accessories. Save files show more info, there's only 3 manual saves instead of 4 manual saves, and saves can be deleted. Your file can't be named, so Booster's Tower pulls your name from your Switch user profile. When you game over, you'll return to the save file selection screen instead of your last save location, so you can't retain XP or coins and subsequently can't farm XP with stars anymore. Input windows for action commands are a bit more lenient and generally occur during different moments in an enemy's animation. For example, in the original, there's some where it's after the attack and accompanied by a sound effect, or during the wind-up animation. In the remake, some of those may instead be when the impact of the attack happens. Super jumps also still go down to 3 frames, and the rhythm of the jumps is slower. Thankfully, Culex's hurtbox doesn't move with him anymore, so it's more consistent to jump on him. Stat-wise, parameters across the board are generally identical, though enemies don't have separate physical and magic evasion stats anymore. The suit icons are now gone when casting, but generally abilities and attacks are much faster. There's an indicator to help you time your attacks and block enemy attacks. Perfect attack action commands result in AoE damage, and enough correct inputs also takes away the indicator until you miss an input. And with blocking, perfect blocks have this shield now. You're now told when the enemy's attack is unblockable, and some previously unblockables like single target spells can now be blocked. You can now swap party members mid-battle, letting you utilize your whole party more efficiently, and when a party member is incapacitated, you'll be given the option to swap them out. When all 3 characters are down, they'll automatically swap to your 2 backup characters. Thought Peak now shows an enemy's elemental weakness and vulnerable statuses. Mallow also starts with Thought Peak rather than getting it at level 6. Geno's attacks now show 5 stars instead of 3, and Peach's Group Hug doesn't remove the beneficial effect of Red Essence anymore. Birdo's eggs can be blocked via action command instead of defending, you can move freely around vines, and the machine-made versions of Spiritovich don't drop rock candies anymore. The signal ring is now found in the Mushroom Kingdom shop basement, so you can use it from the start of the game, and in its original place is the Echo Signal ring, which makes a noise and rumbles when hidden treasure is close by. One of the hidden treasures in the forest maze was moved, and a save block was put before the Bowyer fight. The invisible floor in the 6-door challenge can be triggered by jumping while moving. Before, you had to jump in place. The Lazy Shell and Safety Ring no longer grant immunity to elemental damage and instead reduce it heavily. However, they still grant immunity on breezy difficulty. Item descriptions were updated, though hidden attributes are still hidden. Freebie rates were increased and now consistently 33% for all items now, and there's more flower tabs defined. There is a very obscure flower jar you get from the toad that had their wallet stolen by Croco instead of a frog coin if you revisit him 1. After Marrymore, and 2. Getting the frog coin from the Rosetown treasure hunter via already finding the forest maze treasure boxes before giving him stairs. And if that sounds confusing, it's because it is, because these 2 characters have nothing to do with each other. However, in the remake, it's not possible to get that flower jar anymore. In the Tall Cliff minigame, the time required for prizes were actually reduced by a second, making the minigame harder. Knife Guy's juggling is now slower, and the lucky minigame egg is visibly trackable now, where before the shuffle animation was fixed and the answer was random. Great Guy's casino games were changed from slot machine and blackjack to item match in a memory game, and they are now free to play and give item rewards instead of frog coins. Beatlemania now has a Game Boy border, shells explode if they're untouched, and heart pickups stop dropping at 90 million points. The sniffets running around at Booster's wedding are not as sporadic. Croco stays still longer when chasing him. The triathlon puzzle was wholly rewritten and generally gives you more information. Dr. Topper's quiz still pulls from a pool of 40 questions, but 2 were removed and 2 were added. The Booster's Hill minigame added red barrels, so barrels stay the whole time even when the sniffets start moving. You also recover faster when hit from the very back. The Midas River barrel coin patterns were also altered. Toadofsky's first song hint isn't straightforward now, but the third song hint has a note sheet by it. The Yoshi Race minigame now has an on-screen indicator during the race. A number of pre-rendered cutscenes were introduced for various scenes and boss fights that also start with differently angled cutscenes. In general, these scenes play out the same with minor differences here and there. The scenes with the most changes found are the visually extended ending and credits. Lighting is consistent, and the use of an orthographic camera maintain a camera similar to that of the original game, but in 3D, giving this remake a proper look comparable to the original. Many 3D remakes of older games would benefit greatly from this approach. Color palettes in general were closely referenced or deliberately altered depending on the location, while backgrounds and map edges were expanded and fleshed out, and in some locations and battle backgrounds there's more considerate details present. The world map is now seamlessly together and has more details in it. Some models are based on their original sprites rather than their original renders. For monsters, this is because their sprites were actually made first, and then their renders for manuals and magazines came later. The color of some items were changed, and bombs now resemble their renders rather than the sprites. Full party items now have 3 straws in them. Kulex's basic attack now flashes like a Final Fantasy enemy, and when defeated, he disintegrates not unlike Final Fantasy bosses do rather than popping. Original characters of the Super Mario RPG resemble their original designs, though characters with modern designs feature characteristics from them such as Peach, Bowser, Birdo, and Yoshi's, though Boshi still stands out. Some visual changes benefit gameplay, like Poundette's Fear Hammer has purple smoke on it, and the invisible passage in the Nimbus Castle is easier to find. The nature of the animations are maintained as if the original sprites were used as keyframes. Some details are added, such as characters aiming towards whoever they're attacking, enemies being defeated before popping, swimming, Croco being hit by fire, and Clay Morton being hit by electricity. People have also noted Valentina's hit animation is different as well. You can also now visually tell when an enemy is afflicted by a status ailment. The UI has more modern design philosophy now, and instead of rising from a pipe when you level up, everyone's on stage and dances for whoever's leveling up. Performance-wise, we go from 256 by 224 at 60 FPS to a native 1080p docked and 720p undocked that goes up to 60 FPS, but doesn't always maintain it in cities or when there's a lot of effects on screen. Alongside the original soundtrack is a new rearranged soundtrack option, and some of these arrangements change or even add in new parts of the music. And a lot more sound effects than you would think are retained, but Bowser and Yoshi now use their modern voice effects. Super Mario RPG remains simple with a distinct art style, though the Switch version pays respects to the original game in strides, and the new mechanics help keep things engaging without resorting to things like boosters or speed-up options. Starting to notice a trend in these turn-based games in 2024. The original, to a degree, could be considered more challenging across the board, though it isn't too hard to begin with, and regardless, the post-game battles supersede the difficulty of the original game significantly. While the original game's art style can still hold up, the Remake also sets a higher standard for remakes going forward, as games like Secret of Mana would have benefited greatly from this direction. That being said, leave in the comments how you feel about the remake compared to the original. And that's all for this video. Stay tuned for the updated Persona 3 port review, which will include a revisement of the review from last year, as well as coverage of Persona 3 Reload. So, till next time, thank you for watching.